Welcome to episode 16 of the Essential GovCon Brief from the Gordon Reese Law Firm. I'm Patrick Burns, joined by my co-host Quyen Dang.
Thanks, Patrick. This month, we're covering two major developments in the federal contracting space. We've got the continuing government shutdown now entering its second month, which appears to be resolving, and the Department of Defense's new DFARS rule, which restricts certain consulting services involving foreign entities.
The shutdown has certainly created widespread uncertainty for contractors across the country. With funding interruptions, slowed payment, and limited communication from contracting officers, now nearing the end of the shutdown, what appears to be the end of the shutdown, we'll discuss how contractors can assess their contracting funding status, respond appropriately to written direction from the government, and document performance impacts to protect their rights once operations resume.
Yeah, then we'll turn to the new DFARS clause, which establishes new certification requirements for firms providing consulting services to the DoD while also working with covered foreign entities such as China and Russia. We'll break down who's affected and what steps contractors should be taking now to stay compliant.
So let's start with the shutdown. We're now well into the second month of the government shutdown, which hopefully will be resolving shortly, but there's no telling at this point. So contractors across the country are feeling this strain, certainly. This lapse in appropriations has frozen funding for thousands of programs, delayed invoice payments, and disrupted normal communication with federal contracting officers. For many, the question isn't just when the shutdown will end, but how to manage performance obligations in the meantime.
Right, and one of the core issues for contractors right now is understanding how their contract is funded. That determines whether performance can lawfully continue or must pause pending new appropriations. So, if your contract is fully funded, meaning all funds were obligated at award or through prior modification, performance can often continue during a shutdown, provided the work doesn't depend on government facilities that are closed or personnel who are furloughed.
However, if the contract is incrementally funded, the situation is different. So once the obligated funds are exhausted, the contractor has to stop incurring additional costs and immediately notify the contracting officer under the limitations of funds clause. So until the government issues additional funding, new work is at your own financial risk. So the Anti-Deficiency Act makes it illegal for agencies to accept work that would obligate funds not yet appropriated.
Yeah, and during a shutdown, most contracting officers are furloughed, so agencies can only retain those designated as accepted under their contingency plans, generally a very small number, handling emergency or safety related work. That means direction from the government is limited and written communication becomes critical. So if you can't reach your contracting officer, consider sending a written notice summarizing your funding status, the percentage of funds remaining, and your intent to wait further direction. That correspondence will help preserve your rights later if you need to seek an equitable adjustment.
That's exactly right. So when the government does issue direction, it may come through a stop work order or suspension of work notice. These orders formally instruct contractors to pause all or part of their performance. They don't terminate a contract. Rather, they freeze work until the funding returns. Those documents are essential because they establish a clear start and stop point for any future requests for equitable adjustment.
Right, and documentation should start the moment the shutdown affects your operations. So you should be keeping daily records showing when work stopped, which employees were idled, and what equipment was on standby, and what costs continued to accrue. Think about creating a separate accounting code for shutdown-related costs so that these expenses are easy to identify later. Segregating idle time wages, equipment rentals, and storage fees will make your eventual reimbursement claim far easier to substantiate.
So another key point involves labor obligations. While federal employees designated as accepted may be required to work without pay until appropriations return, which will hopefully be shortly, private sector contractors cannot do that. Federal and state labor laws require timely payment for all hours worked. Contractors may reassign or furlough employees who can't perform during the shutdown, but they cannot ask them to volunteer time.
And this is also a time to review cash flow planning. Even if your contract is fully funded, invoice processing may be delayed because payment offices are short-staffed. Contractors should prepare for slower reimbursements and consider temporary financing options or credit lines to cover payroll and operating costs. Smaller businesses are often hit hardest by these cash flow disruptions, so proactive planning is essential.
And you can't forget about your subcontractors and suppliers. They need clear communication about whether work should continue or pause. Review your subcontracts to ensure you have rights to withhold or delay performance consistent with the government's direction. If you're a prime in a contract that is paused, you want to align your subcontractors immediately to prevent unauthorized work.
And while performance may be limited, compliance obligations still exist. Contractors should continue to maintain cybersecurity controls, ethics trainings, and reporting requirements that remain active regardless of funding status. So, for example, if your company holds data subject to NIST or CMMC obligations, Those protections must remain in place during the shutdown.
Looking ahead, planning for the restart is critical. Historically, once appropriations are restored, agencies move quickly to clear the backlog of modifications, payments, and solicitations. And so contractors that have maintained communication and documentation will be well positioned to resume work immediately. So use this time to update your internal systems, verify SAM.gov registration, check that small business certifications are current, and prepare proposals for upcoming opportunities. Agencies often release a flood of solicitations right after a funding lapse ends.
Exactly. It's hard to overemphasize. Contractors who are organized now will be able to restart faster, invoice sooner, and recover more effectively. So while this shutdown has caused disruption, it's also an opportunity to strengthen internal procedures from documentation and compliance to subcontract management and cash flow control.
So there's a key takeaway here. Follow written government direction, document everything, and stay ready. You can't control when the funding returns, but you can control how your company manages the disruption and positions itself for recovery. All right, so let's turn to the second major development this month. The Department of Defense's new DFARS clause titled Prohibition Relating to Conflicts of Interest in Consulting Services Certification. Those taking notes at home, the exact DFAR clause is 252, 209, 7012.
Yeah, and this final rule was published in August and took effect a few weeks ago on October 24th. It implements certain provisions of the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2024 and introduces a new compliance requirement for contractors providing consulting services to the DoD.
And this rule applies to contractors under NACE codes beginning with 5416, which covers management, scientific, and technical consulting services, and it applies to both prime and subcontract awards, even below the simplified acquisition threshold, and to commercial item acquisitions under FAR Part 12.
In essence, the rule prohibits the DoD from awarding a consulting services contract to any offer that cannot certify that neither it nor its subsidiaries or affiliates has an active consulting contract or subcontract with a covered foreign entity. Covered entities include foreign governments or organizations associated with China, Russia, and other countries designated as adversarial to U.S. interests.
And if an offeror cannot make that certification, it must submit an auditable conflict of interest mitigation plan. The plan must identify all relevant consulting relationships, outline how the contractor will prevent conflicts of interest, describe procedures for internal oversight, and establish reporting requirements for any potential conflict of interest that may arise.
Yeah, and it's important to understand that the mitigation plan is not a mere formality. It has to be reviewed and approved by the contracting officer, who can reject it or require changes before award. And while there's a narrow waiver mechanism, it can only be granted when it's in the best interests of the United States, and every waiver must be reported to Congress.
The scope of this rule is very broad. It reaches both direct consulting services and indirect work, such as services performed through subsidiaries, affiliates, or joint ventures abroad, and even applies to subcontracts and to commercial contracts that fall within the 5416 NACE codes.
Right, and this rule is part of a broader shift by the DoD to address foreign influence and national security risks across the defense industrial base. So traditionally, these concerns were focused on technology, defense manufacturing, and cyber supply chains. But now they're expanding into advisory and professional services, reflecting the government's view that sensitive insights and advice can be just as strategically valuable as physical tech.
Contractors in the management, consulting, program management, or technical advisory spaces need to assess their global consulting portfolios now. So identify any foreign government or state-owned enterprise clients, map out an affiliate joint venture relationships, and evaluate whether any of those relationships could create a conflict under this rule.
Firms should also update their corporate compliance programs to include internal reporting procedures, training for business development and contract staff, and documentation of foreign affiliations. The goal here is to demonstrate that you have a system in place to prevent and manage conflicts of interest before they become disqualifying.
Because the new rule requires an auditable plan, DoD can ask to see how your procedures actually work in practice. That's a higher standard than the simple self-certification. It's a compliance framework that needs to be operational and defensible.
Yeah, and this rule sends a clear message. The DoD expects its consulting partners to be free from conflicting loyalties, even indirect ones. Contractors that act now by identifying risks and building strong mitigation processes will be positioned to certify confidently when solicitations start including this clause.
It's both a compliance exercise and a business opportunity. Those who can quickly demonstrate readiness under the new rule may have a competitive advantage as DoD prioritizes trusted contractors.
Right. So, Patrick, two very different developments this month, one immediate and one more forward looking, but both demanding careful attention from contractors.
Certainly, the shutdown reinforces the importance of communication, documentation, and readiness. Contractors cannot control the timing of appropriations, which will hopefully occur shortly, but they can control how they document impacts, protect their funding position, and prepare for the restart. This D4 rule underscores that compliance expectations are evolving. Contractors that provide consulting services to DoD need to evaluate global engagements now and make sure that they can certify accurately when bidding.
Yeah, and both issues remind us that in government contracting, preparation and transparency are key, whether it's managing a temporary funding lapse or adapting to a new compliance standard.
That wraps up this month's Essential GovCon Brief, episode 16. We'll continue tracking both the shutdown, if it continues, and DoD's rollout of the new consulting rule, and we'll cover any guidance that follows.
Thanks for joining us. I'm Quyen Dang.
And I'm Patrick Burns, so stay prepared, stay compliant, and we'll see you next month. Thanks for listening.